Our first reading today is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 53, verses 1 to 6, which you'll find on page 742 of the Church Bibles. So that's page 742 of the Church Bibles, Isaiah 53, starting at verse 1. Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. All we, like sheep, have gone astray. We have turned every one to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all.
Our second reading is from Matthew chapter 16, which can be found on page 991 of the Church Bibles. Page 991, Matthew 16. And we'll start from verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his life? Or what shall a man give in return for his life? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom."
So you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. We heard those words last week, do you remember, of Jesus' disciple Peter, back in verse 16. Peter had seen the mighty works of Jesus, the blind seeing, the lame walking, the dead raised. With that, Peter had heard the teaching of Jesus. Such wisdom, such authority. Peter had witnessed, he lived with him, Jesus' compassion, his boldness, his courage. What a man. And Peter knew there was only one conclusion he could possibly draw. This is the Christ, the long-awaited King from God, the one promised to rescue and rule his people. This is the one the world's been waiting for. And you remember Jesus' response in verse 17. He basically said, "That's right." He said, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven." Jesus said, yes, the Father has shown you who I am. You've got it right because he's revealed it to you. And then Jesus, remember, went on to say the stunning words of verse 18. "I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. A glorious future awaits. Jesus says, more and more people from every nation around the world will see that Jesus must be the King, the Christ. They'll turn to him. So the church, his people, will be gathered, will be built up by Jesus. And nothing, not even death or hell, will stand in the way of its growth. Last week was a thrilling week in Matthew's Gospel. I wonder, how on earth can you follow that? Well, it's verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Do you hear that? It is all, isn't it, so wrong. This is the Christ, the glorious King of God's kingdom, the one unstoppably building his church. And he says to his disciples, we're going to Jerusalem. What for? Is there going to be a great battle where Jesus will be crowned as king? Well, he's going to suffer. And not at the hands of a great general or emperor, but no, at the hands of the religious authorities. And not just suffer, they will kill him. And beginning of verse 21, Jesus says, this must happen. The Christ must give his life. It's all so wrong. At least that's what the disciples were convinced of. They couldn't fathom why Jesus was talking like this. They had to stop it, clearly bring Jesus to his senses. Peter couldn't let this pass. And so verse 22, Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But this really is a staggering thing, isn't it, for Peter to say? Do you remember, Peter has just declared that Jesus is the Christ, God's glorious King, ruling over all. And now Peter, who does he think he is, sees fit to rebuke the king, to tell the king, you're wrong. It's striking if you compare verses 21 and 22. Look, so verse 21, Jesus tells Peter the Christ must die. Verse 22, in response, Peter says, Jesus the Christ must not die. And this isn't just a disagreement among friends. Verse 23, Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. Get behind me, Satan. You might remember in Matthew, back in chapter 4, we saw Satan in the wilderness. He was tempting Jesus. Do you remember what Satan was trying to do? Basically trying to get Jesus to take the easy option, the shortcut, to avoid the route the Father had set before him. And now, shockingly, Peter is doing just the same, trying to get Jesus off the way of the cross. And so Jesus says, Peter's denial of the need for Jesus to die is in fact satanic, from hell itself. I mean, we are slightly bewildered reading this. Do you remember last week we saw Jesus called Peter the rock. Now Peter is the stumbling block in Jesus' way. So last week, Peter had obviously grasped the identity of Jesus, the Christ, but it's obvious he has no idea what that actually means. And this is no small mistake, a slip-up. In fact, it's the problem with Peter's whole mindset, we could say, because Jesus says Peter was thinking the world's way. The things of man is how Jesus puts it there at the end of verse 23. He hadn't begun to grasp the things of God. The kind of things Jesus has been teaching about already, but hadn't sunk in to Peter yet. The seriousness of sin, the desperate plight of humanity and what that was, and what had to happen for forgiveness to be possible. Let me ask us, what do we think of Jesus going to his death like this? Now, of course, we read this today with the benefit of hindsight. We've been thinking about it all service. It probably didn't shock most of us to sing and to pray about Jesus' death. We're so used to it. We know he did die as he predicted. But even with that advantage, the challenge for us here is, are we convinced Jesus had to die? That as he put it, it was a must, it was necessary. That there really was no other way that he could go. That actually the reason Jesus is such a glorious king is because he died like this. Now, it's actually very easy to nod along. I'm sure we think that. Yes, I think I do know that, I think. I'm persuaded. Yes, I think I get it. But the challenge is whether we do really. And it turns out there is actually a way to discover whether or not we are persuaded that Jesus had to die. Because no sooner has Jesus declared to his disciples that he must die, that before he then goes on to say any more, he begins to spell out immediately the implications. Because the way that we live shows whether or not we believe that Jesus had to die. Our lives will demonstrate whether we are living according to the things of man or the things of God. And the basic question is actually devastatingly simple, and it's this: are you losing your life? Are you losing your life? I wonder how you would answer that question today. And that is the question that matters, because the Christ follower must lose his or her life. The Christ follower must lose his life. Verse 24, Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." Now, if it was unsettling enough, to say the least, for the disciples to hear what the future held for the Christ, well, now the shock would hit even closer to home. Jesus is now saying what the future must hold for any who would be his follower. So, do you want to follow Jesus? Well, for a start, you must deny yourself. Jesus is going straight for the control center of your life. Now, what drives you? And I actually know the answer. It's obvious. It's you, as in it's me. I drive my life by nature. That's what I want. It looks slightly different for all of us. We have different backgrounds, different situations, but we all try and make the best of it for ourselves. And that's considered completely normal. That's what everyone does, obviously. We're used to it. Deny self, says Jesus. You don't get to run your life anymore. You don't get to decide what you think is in your best interests or how to live. Your desires are not there to be fulfilled. Instead, Jesus says, put your life completely in the hands of another. And of course, he means his hands, the hands of the king. So what then is it that the king would have us do? Well, next he says here, any follower must take up his cross. The Roman Empire crucified thousands. It was a common sight in the first century, so it wouldn't be unusual back then to see a condemned man carrying the crossbeam on the way to the place of execution. So just imagine you were alive then, and it was quite a spectacle. So you were there on the roadside, and imagine as the man carried his cross passing by you, well, you heard him talk about his future, his hopes, his ambitions, the plans for next week, the holiday in the summer, the career opportunity he was hoping to pursue, what he wanted to achieve, what he was wanting for his children. I mean, it would be laughable. It'd be ridiculous. You'd be thinking to yourself, doesn't he realize his life's over? And consider too, why did the Romans get the condemned to carry their cross? Now, it wasn't simply because there'd been a failure in logistical planning in how to get the crossbeam to the place of execution from A to B and how to ask the condemned for a favor. The point was, this was a spectacle. It was to be seen, to be public. So put very simply, if someone takes up their cross, the world will notice. And so for us, if we follow Jesus, the world will know. Not because we're quite a nice person. No, because we're a dead person. They'll see we are dead to ourselves, that any life in us is all about another. And then end of verse 24, Jesus says, follow me. Obviously, no Twitter back then, that's not what he means, as if at Jesus is someone who interests us. Nor does it mean simply follow Jesus' teaching. Some people say they like his teaching and they follow it, although what they often mean is they pick and choose what inspires them in their spiritual life. No, he means follow him. Follow the Jesus who has just said he must suffer and die. He says, come and join me on this road. Follow in losing life. It's there in the word follow, isn't it? Jesus says, I must die. You can follow, but this is where you follow. Worth just saying that the phrasing here in our ESV translation is a little bit weak, because there in verse 24 it says, if anyone would come after me, let him do these things. And you might think that sounds like we might have to allow this to happen if the worst comes to the worst. But actually here, Jesus is giving 3 imperatives. That is, the king is giving commands. 3 of them from the king. Other translations put it a little bit clearer, and they say, if anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up cross, and follow. It's not about an optional extra worst case scenario. The king is saying, are you with me? Deny self, take up cross, follow. So let me ask you as I ask myself, are you doing that? Denying self, taking up cross, and following. If we've even begun to really hear what Jesus is saying, we know the obvious, natural response is, no way will I do that. If you're not thinking that, then it might be that actually you haven't really understood what Jesus is saying. Because who in their right minds would do this? Why deny self, take up cross, and follow on that way of the cross? Well, verse 25 begins for. That is, Jesus is about to give the reasoning for what he commands. Let's read that verse together. For, Jesus says, whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Now this sounds paradoxical, doesn't it? No doubt Jesus does that deliberately to get us thinking. Save life, lose it. Lose life, save it. Because this is the things of God, things of man. Jesus wants to turn our thinking on its head, that we look at things differently. Not the world's way, which we're so used to, which we think of as normal, but instead God's way. Because by default, we are all trying to save life now. That is, just make the most of it. We'll be dead soon. Make sure your bite of the cherry is a big one. And Jesus says, well, that's normal, but those who live like that will in fact lose everything. And without Jesus, that is where we are heading. But there is an alternative. That is, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Losing life for Jesus' sake is a summary of what we've just seen, denying self and taking up the cross. And Jesus says those who do that, who miss out on life, it seems, or what it has to offer, will in fact save life. And that life there is life, if you like, with a capital L. He says, you will get life as it was designed to be, life to the full, life at its very best for all eternity. It'll be yours. So are you losing your life now? Or will you lose it then? I hope if we're taking this at all seriously, we are thinking, I wonder just what that means in practice. What will it look like to lose life now? Well, just recently I received the Wycliffe Bible Translators newsletter. There was an article there about a devout young Muslim lady from a Central Asian country. She left home to learn English, and the way it was taught was through reading the Bible. Her father had given his blessing for her to go, but told her, you can read the Bible, but don't become a Christian. If you do, I will kill you. She told her father not to worry. But as she read her Bible, as she was taught English, in the pages of scriptures, she met Jesus. In time, she felt she had to go home to tell her family. Her father thought she was coming back to say she was going to get married, but she told him, quote, "I have found something even more valuable." His response, "I said I would kill you, so I'm going to get my knife and I am going to kill you." "Will this Jesus protect you?" he asked her. To which she responded, quote, "I don't know, Dad, but I do know this, that if I die now, I will see God face to face. But if you don't kill me now, I get to live here on this earth and tell you about him. It's a privilege either way." Well, thankfully, that lady's mother intervened and she lived. Now, that's a stirring story, but I think there's a problem with a story like that for us. We read it and we think, well, yes, okay, if I was ever put in that sort of situation, a kind of a gun to the head moment, then yes, I get what Jesus wants me to do, and I might even pretend to myself that, yeah, I would do that. But the point really for us is that most of the time our experience isn't like that. And Jesus isn't saying that we might lose our lives for him if that kind of thing happens, but that we will. So let's keep asking, what does it mean today, day to day, in London, to lose my life now? And the way we must answer that is by looking at the rest of Matthew's gospel. Do you remember how the gospel ends? Do you remember the risen King Jesus gave his people their marching orders? "Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations." That is to be our overriding priority and task to which we are to give ourselves. And that is connected to what Jesus says here. Because you might say, well, what has losing life got to do with that? Until we might remember that we looked at it a while ago here at the 4 p.m. was chapter 10. Back in that chapter, Jesus has already spoken about taking up cross and losing life. I'd encourage us to go back and read the whole chapter, really. We haven't got time to do that now, but it's a chapter about Jesus preparing his disciples for life on mission, for the Christian life. And the headline message was that they would bear witness for Jesus. And the rest of the chapter tells us what that would be like, what to expect, what to be prepared for. He does say in that chapter that there will be moments when their physical life would be in danger. But not all the time. But still they were to lose their lives for Jesus, whatever the consequences. So what does that mean? Well, the rest of the chapter shows us. I'll just pick out a few things. In chapter 10, Jesus says the disciples should expect trouble with the authorities. And so we should therefore expect that as well. If we lose our life for Jesus, senior management will want a word. There might well be an email from HR. The boss will give you the cold shoulder. It might be more than that. It even could be maybe a knock on the door from the police, especially as our society drifts more and more away from God's ways. So the authorities. Chapter 10 also tells us that losing life means persecution is to be expected in the way that it really will happen. And Jesus warns us the persecution will even come from those very close to us, people we thought were friends. Even, he says, your family members will turn against you. Follow Jesus, there won't be peace, but trouble, Jesus says. Also in chapter 10, Jesus says those losing life should expect to be maligned. Now, isn't it true that our reputation, what people think of us, matters so much? I mean, we care what strangers think of us. But even more, what about our school friends, or maybe university mates, or maybe those in the same cohort as us in the grad scheme? Can you bear the thought that when they get together and you're not there, they will laugh at you and malign you because you are losing your life for Christ? Can you bear that? Well, Jesus says there's no avoiding it. We will live in a way, we will say things in the full knowledge that others won't like it, and they won't be slow to say so. If there's any sense that we think that you can lose life for Jesus and somehow still fit in with the world around us, we simply haven't been paying attention. And we could think of that about London. I mean, have we realized London simply can't stand Jesus? Yes, some parts of London might pay a little bit of lip service to Jesus sometimes, maybe at Christmas time, but it's a Jesus of London's own imagination that doesn't threaten them at all, that they can just ignore at will when they want to. But speak of the true Jesus, the King Jesus, who demands all people repent in what they think, in what they say, in what they do. They don't like that Jesus. A Jesus who tells us what to stand for, even during Pride Month, even when the latest progressive initiative is unveiled. Or even the Jesus who says what we've been thinking about this afternoon, that tells London that what he faced hanging on that cross is actually what we deserve, everybody. That his death is London's only hope. Well, that Jesus, the true Jesus, London actually can't stand. And if our lives are to be about him, well, there will be consequences as we bear witness. Striking, isn't it? If our aim for our London life is the straightforward, easy, comfortable life, free from enemies, held in esteem by all, which is basically what everyone wants, Jesus says, forget it. Lose that life. Are you doing that? Let me just say, if you're not sure you're losing your life, then that's a pretty loud alarm bell, because I think you would notice. You might be prompted to say, as I am, well, does that mean that Jesus says we can never have any fun? No, it doesn't mean that. Does it mean we can't enjoy the good gifts that God gives us? No, it doesn't mean that. But as soon as we start asking those questions, making those caveats, very quickly, we lose sight of the plain meaning of what Jesus does say. We miss the obvious and obscure it. He simply says, you must lose your life. We may not be physically killed, but we'll notice because it'll be costly. And again, you might say, well, is this all there is to following Jesus? Well, no, far from it. Come to me, says Jesus, and you will find rest for your souls. A little bit later in Matthew, follow Jesus, and he promises your life you will improve 100-fold, even now. Those wonderful promises of blessings are true, but they don't cancel out what we see here. I think sometimes we think, well, maybe both extremes, Jesus says, somehow average themselves out. Well, no. Following Jesus is the very best life now. But at the same time, it is losing life. Maybe we're thinking, well, okay, maybe I will lose life for Jesus, but not just yet. Once I've got through the probation period in this new role, once I'm on the property ladder, well, once the children are just that little bit older, once I'm just a bit more secure financially, then. Although again, soon in Matthew's gospel, we're about to encounter a rich young ruler who had it all. Ask him if following Jesus became any easier. He just couldn't do it. If anything, as we get into the habit of living for ourselves, it'll only get harder. If we won't lose our lives for Jesus today, what makes us think we will seriously do it then? I wonder, as we feel the weight clearly of what Jesus is asking of us, his potential followers, he does have a couple of questions down in verse 26. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his life? Well, I saw in the Evening Standard this week a new detached property has gone on the market up in Highgate. It's a cool 40 million. It's got a gym, tennis court, pool, cinema, obviously, standard. But what makes it, unique selling points are its rooftop terrace, which has spectacular views over Hampstead Heath. But the number one property of it is privacy. Not a single window overlooks this property. And that property, Jesus says, might be yours one day. You might get it. Your career might reach the top. You might win the lottery. You might then have the holiday villa. You might have the kids who are so successful. You might get to live the dream. The world might be yours. But what if you forfeit your soul with it? Obviously, we can debate how much status and money and toys actually deliver in this life, but what is certain, we can't take them with us when we go. How much did the deceased leave? Everything. And Jesus here, doesn't he? He makes an assumption I think we'll all agree with, that life, in fact, our lives are very valuable. That is true. Our souls, who we are, matters. In the end, they do matter more than all this world has to offer. But what if in our pursuit now of what we think matters, even if you get it, what if you do that, but in the process miss out on what matters most of all? What then does the future hold? Well, let the King tell you in verse 27. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done." We've seen Son of Man, haven't we, this title a number of times. It's from the Old Testament. It's for the Christ. It's associated with kingdom and dominion and glory and power. Jesus unashamedly takes that title for himself. And so he declares here that a day is coming when he will stand in glory, surrounded by the angels, with God the Father, as well as surrounded by every person who's ever lived. Each of us, everyone we speak to this coming week, everyone on planet Earth will be standing before him to give account. And on that day, of course, the few assets we managed to amass down here, the amazing experiences we posted on social media for our friends to see, well, it'll all count for so little. What will matter will be, did we listen to the words of Jesus? Whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. In the end, doesn't it, it all comes down to that little phrase in verse 25, loses his life for my sake. That is, what is our view of Jesus? If Jesus is not who he claims to be, if he is not the King, the Christ, the Son of Man, then his words here are nothing less than the outrageous words of a megamaniac, an evil madman. You wouldn't listen to him for a moment. You wouldn't lose your life for him. If Jesus is a fraud, then, well, as you are, make the best fist of life, best you can, eat, drink, and be merry. There is nothing else. But have we realized? Have we seen what Peter did see, that the man Jesus who walked this earth is the eternal God stepping into history, the glorious, long-awaited Christ? And do we get it that his determination to die wasn't an embarrassing mistake? Instead, that was the rescue mission the world so desperately needed. And have we grasped that death is the most astonishing demonstration of love this world has ever seen, and that he did it for me? If I've grasped that, how could I possibly go on living for myself, satisfying myself with a few creature comforts, pursuing the empty accolades of the world? These are hard words from Jesus, but they're so kind, designed to wake us up from our stupor, to challenge us, to die to all that, and instead give yourselves to this King, to Jesus. He is worthy of all that we are. And yes, then give our lives to play our part in discipling the nations for him. What do you want to give your life for? Do you want to give it for the world to think much of you, how great you are? Or do you want to give your life for the world to make much of Jesus and how great he is? Is it our longing that more and more people come to know Jesus now, get to know him better, that they would stand with us on that last day with Jesus? Well, are we ready for that day? Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow. I'll lead us in a prayer. Our Father, we do praise you that Jesus himself denied himself and that he went the way of the cross for our sake, so that we could receive from him the best life of all that we did not deserve. And so we ask that you would help us now to take him at his word. And so in response, to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and to follow. Amen.